Okay, so we've been talking about database design and breaking up our tables into multiple tables that are dedicated basically to one subject. So our example from this course is our employees table and our offices table. So we've talked about how to take a spreadsheet with all of this information and divide it into two tables. But what we haven't talked about yet is how to then reconnect these tables so that they work together. And the way that we do that is through relationships and keys. And if you remember from earlier in the course when we were setting this up, we created this key, this primary key. And I'll go to our design view so I can show you. Remember, we had this little key over here, and it created an auto number so that each office has a unique office ID. And in this lecture, we're going to talk more about the primary keys and how to create those relationships between the tables. So the definition of a primary key is a column that uniquely identifies each record or row in a table. And the important thing to remember about a primary key is that it should be unique and meaningless. For example, you wouldn't want to use our employee's phone number as a primary key because phone numbers change from person to person. So one person might have a phone number for a year and then give it back to the phone company, and it would go to another person. So that phone number is no longer specifically unique to that person, or in our case, that employee. You could also, especially in the old days, you could have one home phone that was used by several people. So again, it's just not unique enough. The employee's name would also be a bad choice as a primary key because you could potentially have two people with the same name. So you can either use an auto number, which ensures that it will be unique, or if you already have a system in place, you could use a customer ID or an employee ID, or for instance, a student ID number at a university, as long as it's unique to each person and you have a numbering system that allows it to expand as your numbers of people expand. A couple of other poor choices for primary keys would be a social security number. The reason for this is it is unique, but the problem is it's not meaningless. It's actually a very significant number, and in fact it's something that should be kept secure and private. So to be using it as a identifier is not necessarily an appropriate use of it. Zip codes are another example. It might seem like a good idea to use them if you only have an office in each city, but if you were to add an office in that same zip code, then you start to run into problems with your numbering system, and you have to start getting creative with how you use your primary keys, and that's not what you want to do. So you set it up right from the beginning so you can avoid that. And then finally, email addresses would be a bad choice. Again, these change frequently, and because of that, your data will start to get messy. So as we said, by creating this primary key, we're creating a unique identifier, and we'll switch back to our datasheet view. And in this case, it's an auto number, so it's automatically giving each record a new unique number. And that way we can consistently refer to this record or any of these records in another table just by using this number here. So we go to our employees table and we have Stan Ford, and his office ID is office number 4. And if we go to our office table, then office number 4 has all of this information to go with it, Portland, Oregon, and a phone number. But how does this table know what that 4 means? Well, to be honest, right now it doesn't. So what we're going to do now is go create a relationship between these two tables. Okay, but before we get too far into the relationships, I need to show you one thing so that it doesn't get messed up when you create the relationships. So first, let's go for our employees table. Let's go to Design View. And you just want to double check that this says number. And this should say long integer. That's important. And then we're going to go to the offices table and go to Design View again. and we're going to make sure that that says number for the data type. And down here it says field size long integer. That should be fine. So we can create our relationship. If this says like text or something like that, then you'll want to change it to number. Okay? So what we're going to do now is go create a relationship between these two tables. And the way we do that is we go up here to our database tools, and we have a spot right here for relationships. We click on that, and it's going to bring up a pop-up, and it's going to ask us which tables we want to work with. Well, we only have the two tables right now, so we're going to go ahead and add both of those. And you can double click them and see they'll show up, or you can highlight it and click, and let me slide this out of the way, and click add, and there it is. Okay, so once we're done adding our tables into this window, we can close this pop-up. And now you can see a little schematic of our two tables. So here's our employees table, the employee ID, first name, last name, phone, office ID, and here's our offices. And you can even see that it identifies our little primary keys for each of these. And as we've said, our primary key is the unique identifier to identify each record in this table. And same with over here. So to connect these two tables and create a relationship between them, all we have to do is go to our primary key, left click it, and drag it to where we have that same identifier listed in the other table, and release. Now we're going to get a relationships box that pops up, and it's basically just saying here you want to connect table offices to table employees, and the field that you want to connect is the office ID field. See, we can choose from all the fields, and we want to connect it to the office ID field in the employees table. So those are correct, and you can change those if they need to be different. And then it's asking if we want to enforce referential integrity. And what that means, we're going to say yes, by the way. And what referential integrity means is that because we're linking these two fields in these tables, that this office ID number in the employees table must reference a valid field in the offices table. In other words, we can't have an employee with office number 10 if there isn't an office number 10 in the offices list. And you can see the logic of this, because if we were able to put in an office number 10 that referenced nothing, then our database would be incomplete and inaccurate. So once we've done that, then we can go ahead and click create, and you'll get this little pop-up. If you haven't closed your tables, then it will basically say it can't finish this relationship because these are already in use. So we just click OK, and then we actually have to go back and close these. I often forget to do that. Okay, now we can go back, do the same thing, drag from our office ID down to our office ID. Go ahead and enforce referential integrity and click create. And now you see this little line that's linking these two together. And a couple of more notes on what you're seeing here. The first thing you'll notice is there's a little 1 up here, and there's a little infinity sign here. This indicates that this is what's called a one-to-many relationship. And there are 3 types of relationships that I want to tell you about. The first one is a one-to-one relationship. That would essentially be one item linking to one item. And we're not going to go into that because you don't see that very much in Access. The second type is the one-to-many relationship. And this is the type of relationship you'll see a lot. And this is the perfect example of it right here, because we have one office ID can apply to many different employees. And if this is at all confusing, I want to just tell you right now, please don't worry or stress about it, because table design, or I should say database design, and table relationships are one of the most difficult things to grasp, because as compared to an Excel spreadsheet where it's a flat one-dimensional thing, table relationships have a sense of like 3-dimensionality, and they're very abstract. So it really takes some thinking to figure out how the relationships should be created between tables to make them work properly. So again, don't be hard on yourself if this doesn't make sense immediately. Even people who have used Access a lot often have to kind of sit down and go, okay, which is the one and which is the many? And you kind of have to do like some math in your head sometimes to figure that out. And that's also why we're starting with a very simple example. So that is our one-to-many relationship. And then the third type of relationship is called a many-to-many relationship. And many-to-many relationships become important when you have, many tables, and there's a lot of complex connections between them. And I will give you a quick example of one, just so you have an idea of it, but we're not going to actually create one. Okay, so in this example, I have a many-to-many relationship set up. And this is essentially a very simple order tracking system. So we have our orders, order ID, date ordered. We have our products, product ID, product name, product price. And then we have what's called a junction table, where we create a one-to-many relationship going both directions. So on any order, you can have many products, and any product can go on many orders. So that's just a really brief introduction to that concept, just so that you know what a many-to-many is. But for the purposes of the database that we're creating, we're going to be happy with our one relationship, and it's going to be a one-to-many between our office table and our employees table. So once we've created this, we can go ahead and save it. We can just do save and then close it. And we now have a relationship between these two tables. And at first glance, you don't see anything different in the relationships, but I will show you what is different. If we do a new entry, and we get over here and it's time to select an office ID. Let's look at our offices, our choices. We have 1 through 8, Boise to Denver. Let's try and pick a number 9, an entry that doesn't exist in this table. When I hit 9 and hit enter, it gives us an error. You cannot add or change a record because a related record is required in table offices. So now that we have this relationship between the two tables, this office ID field, which is now linked to our office table, will only allow entries from that table. So now I can delete that and enter in office number 8 and hit enter, and it's perfectly happy with it. And as we start to create forms and queries and reports, you're going to really see the power of this for being able to access the data in that other table. Now there's one final definition that I'm going to share with you, which is just some terminology. This employee ID is, as we talked about before, called the primary key, right? And if we look in our design view, it's got the key next to it. That's our primary key, so it's our unique identifier. This office ID down in the bottom is what's called a foreign key. And a foreign key is a key that references a primary key in another table. So we know that that foreign key here, the office ID number, is referring to the primary key in this table. And we can look at it better by looking here. So here's our office ID primary key, and here's our office ID foreign key in the employees table. And one other thing you'll notice is that in those relationships, they have to be the same data type. So in our employees table, our office ID is a number, and in our offices table, the office ID is an auto number. Now that sounds different, but they're actually both a number data type. So because we've created this as an auto number, we've also referred to this as number. So that's an introduction to the concepts of primary keys and foreign keys, relationships, and remember we have 3 types of relationships: one-to-one, one-to-many, and many-to-many. And the one-to-many is the most common type of relationship. And when we get to forms and queries, I'm going to show you the magic of what that relationship can do.